This is the Anthropology podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Anthropology podcast. This week, I am interviewing Dr. Carlina de la Cova. She is a wonderful guest. One thing that you might have noticed when you went to play this episode is that it's a lot longer than usual. And that's because Dr. de la Cova is both a bioarchaeologist and a forensic anthropologist. Two specialties equal twice the time, at least this time. If you're interested in one specialty or the other, just know that the first half of the show focuses more on historical bioarchaeology and the second half focuses more on forensic archaeology. One thing I wanted to do was I wanted to thank a listener. I only know him by his handle. His name is Mike Anth, as far as I'm concerned. And I wanted to thank him because he is the first person to have actually written a review for me on iTunes. I really, really, really appreciate it. And I just wanted to remind everyone that if you really like the show, it would be great if you could rate and review it on iTunes. Maybe subscribe if you've been enjoying, maybe one or two at a time. Just that way, the next time I do a show, it just pops up in your feed. Anyway, thank you all so much for your time. I do really, really appreciate every single one of you. As usual, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. At least 4 people can now attest to the fact that I do, in fact, respond if you email me. I hope everyone is having a great day. Everyone stay healthy and stay safe out there and enjoy the show. Hello, everyone. This is Gabby LaPera. Welcome to another episode of the Anthropology podcast. This time, I am interviewing Dr. Carlina de la Cova of the University of South Carolina, the original USC, in my opinion. And I have her here on Skype, so if you hear any weird electronic noises, that's what's going on. But I'm sure this is going to be a great show anyway. Thank you for joining us, Dr. de la Cova.
Thank you for having me. I'm very honored to be here.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you do and what's your job, what you're studying?
So I'm a biological anthropologist. I was trained at Indiana University under the direction of Della Cook. My interest primarily lies in really understanding anatomical collections and who the individuals were in those collections and the narratives that have sort of emerged from those collections. So I work with 3 anatomical collections here in the U.S., the Hammond Todd collection, the Robert J. Terry collection, and the William Montague Cobb collection. And I've been working with these collections since 2004, 2005, when I started my dissertation research. And it's been interesting getting to know the history of these collections and who these individuals were in these collections and the narratives that emerged from these collections. So thus far, there have been 3 narratives for me in my work. One is the impoverished and the marginalized. The other is the Great Migration and what happened to African Americans who migrated to these cities in which these collections were located.
So I'm just going to stop you real quick right there and ask you, the Great Migration, for people who aren't as familiar with U.S. history, we do have some listeners outside the country. Can you explain what that is?
So the Great Migration was something that occurred at the start of the 20th century, around the time of World War I, a little before World War I, about 1910 into about 1960. And it was a massive movement of African Americans from the South into the North, seeking better life. And there were a number of push and pull factors. The major push factors were the South at this time period, obviously, was in its Jim Crow era. Many of these individuals were sharecroppers, and there was a boll weevil plague, an epidemic that literally went through the South and decimated the crops, resulting obviously in a decline in production and income. And then pull factors was the attraction of the North. You had jobs that were opening now, especially during World War I, that hadn't been open to African Americans before, that were now opening up. So you have jobs, you have the hope of racial integration, and a better life, seeking a better life for their families. So the Great Migration is one of these narratives that has emerged in my research with these collections, the individuals who sort of got lost in that Great Migration and who died and they weren't claimed when they died, and their bodies were dissected, and they ended up in these collections. And then the third one that my graduate students and I have been working on has been institutionalization. There's a large number of, particularly women of European ancestry and descent in these collections that were in state hospitals, state mental hospitals, in Missouri, as well as Ohio, and Washington, D.C., which is where these collections originate.
Yeah, I feel like I can definitely see the thread running through all of your interests, right? You're looking at marginalization, you're looking at the effects of basically hardship on the human body and the physical effects that you see on the skeleton as a result.
Right, right. So essentially, how does environment, how does one's social situation, how do the broader sort of forces that are beyond these individuals' control in regard to their status, in regard to their ancestry, how do these things impact them on a biological level?
Yeah, and I think this is something that you see that definitely still resonates today, right? These are still a lot of the same questions and problems that we're dealing with as a society in 2020.
It's very true. And in fact, one of my graduate students, Madeline Atwell, right now is looking at the impact of institutionalization on women in these collections, for those women that were institutionalized. And we know this because in these collections, we have a good idea of where these bodies came from, these individuals came from. And so we know if they're coming from state hospitals. And so she's been analyzing those individuals, and she's looking at sort of the impact of institutionalization at the skeletal level, and then bringing it forward into the present today in terms of the treatment of the mentally ill today, and how things have or have not changed. But that's one sort of narrative that remains consistent. Also, in terms of the marginalization of African Americans, it's another narrative that remains consistent in the sense that structural violence is one of those things. It's easy, but it's difficult to define for folks who may not be familiar with the term, because it's something that is in place. I'm trying to think of a good way to define it for the public.
Why don't you give an example of it in action?
Mental institutions, because there was an attitude towards the mentally ill during the early 20th century, sort of this attitude that they were, because of the eugenics movement and a number of other things, that they were different. It was catching mental illness. It could be, people believe that it could be passed on through one's traits or whatnot, thanks to the eugenics movement. And mentally ill folks were essentially marginalized. Folks who were mentally ill were essentially, I don't like the term disappeared, but in many instances, families put them in mental institutions, or husbands who wanted to get remarried, for example, would have their wives declared insane and have them put in mental institutions, literally disappeared. And so now these individuals are at the mercy of the mental hospital, which is funded by the state, right? But the state continually would cut funding to these hospitals, and this resulted in overcrowding, understaffing. So there weren't the proper number of doctors needed, the proper number of nurses, the proper number of attendants. The attendants were poorly trained. Some weren't even trained to be mental health assistants, but they were given a job through political patronage and favors via politics. And so this in turn, overcrowding, not enough doctors, not enough nurses, not enough attendants, some attendants who abuse patients. This in turn results in exacerbation of injuries and illness in the mental health setting. So, for example, in my own research, there's a high rate of, amongst the institutionalized in my samples, there's a high rate of hip fractures. And reading through the cases, some of these hip fractures could have been prevented. At first, I thought, oh, these are women. They're in their 60s, they're in their 70s, they're in their 80s. Hip fractures usually happen around this time as a result of osteoporosis. But when you start reading that he slipped and fell in the bathroom, in the case of a male, he slipped and fell in the bathroom and fractured his hip, or perhaps the most glaring one for me is one individual that I've studied. She was actually pushed to the floor by another patient, and that patient was a more violent patient. She pushed the patient to the floor, and pushing the patient to the floor, the patient broke her hip and she died a month later. And so, again, not enough attendants to observe these individuals, not enough nurses to care for these individuals, and poor separation of more violent inmates from older, more aged inmates. Again.
So I'm just going to break in here and tell our listeners that a lot of times hip fractures in the elderly, they can end up being a death sentence, especially back then, because it's very, very hard to recover from this. And like once you lack mobility, especially in a place as patently awful as these mental institutions, it becomes very difficult to continue living.
Right. And that's the case here. So that's structural violence on a larger level. When you think about societal attitude towards a group of individuals, and then it's sort of embodied by the way that the state or the way that a particular government entity is running things, and that attitude sort of is embodied by that entity, then it becomes reflected in the individuals that are affected by these laws, this legislation, these institutions that are under state control.
Oh, man, this is going to be a heavy interview, I can tell.
Well, I mean, it even goes back to the way that these collections were formed when we think about it, right? So these collections are collections as biological anthropologists we've based our discipline upon, right? These are the collections, particularly the Hammond Todd collection, which is curated at the Cleveland Natural History Museum, and the Robert J. Terry Skeletal Collection, which was collected in St. Louis, Missouri, by Robert J. Terry, who was a professor of anatomy at Washington University, but it's currently curated at the Smithsonian. These two collections have been the major collections in which everything that formulates our discipline in terms of human identification and the identification of a biological profile, right? So determining a person's age, determining a person's ancestry, their stature, all the things that we sort of do when we're, if you think like the show Bones, right?
Yeah.
All those things we learned from these two collections. Now we've built on those methods through time using other samples, but really the formation of the discipline in that respect comes from these two collections. But the problem with that is that these two collections are comprised of individuals who did not say, hey, I want to will my body to anatomy. State laws indicated, and this is another form of structural violence, state laws indicated, anatomical acts indicated that if you die in institutions that are funded by the public or the taxpayer, including charity hospitals, mental institutions, jails, those sorts of places, or if your body is unclaimed, it will be presented to the state anatomical board, and then the state anatomical board will distribute the body to an institution of higher medical learning or an institution of undertakers for dissection or anatomization or study. And so the individuals in the Hammond Todd collection, all of those individuals, as far as I know, did not say, I want to be dissected.
One thing that's worth noting is that these collections are actually pretty vast, especially in comparison. A lot of the other people that folks have heard from so far on this podcast, they're paleoanthropologists, right? So they have a sample size of 1 or 2, or maybe they're bioarchaeologists and they have a sample size of like 20 from a historic cemetery. These collections aren't like that. They are much, much larger.
Right. The Hammond Todd collection has over 3,000 individuals, and the Terry collection has about 1,728 individuals. And the story is the same for the Terry collection, except in 1955-56, the Missouri World Body Law was passed, and then individuals started donating their bodies for dissection. So there is a sort of It's clear, who in the collection, who is donated and who isn't. I've worked with all non-willed individuals, so individuals who died and they were unclaimed, or they died in state institutions and nobody claimed their bodies.
And what's it like working with individuals that that potentially this isn't what they wanted?
For me, it's always a reminder, because my great-grandmother, so for the first 5 years of my life, I was raised by my great-grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, we say we did the Great Migration and the Return Migration in one generation. And because now we see a movement of African Americans coming from the North back to the South, and we call that the Return Migration. And but she went up to Chicago and during the Great Migration, and had she died in Chicago, because another thing I should point out is that the time frame for claiming an individual was anywhere from 24 to 72 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, even today in the state of Ohio, the time frame I think is 32 to 36 hours to claim an individual, unless they are a traveler. It's stipulated in the codes. But that time frame is so small. I know that if my great-grandmother had passed away, there would be no way they would have been able to locate her family members within that time frame. And she would have been sent to a institution to be anatomized. And so when I study these individuals, it's always a very strong reminder of my own past and my own history and what could have happened to my great-grandmother. And that, for me, is one thing that emotionally connects me to my work. And I feel that I have to tell their story. And when we talk about the Great Migration as well, I mean, we don't, until relatively recently, we haven't heard sort of the stories, the other side of the Great Migration. We hear the positive side about how, folks did well and they were able to improve themselves. But it's only been in the past few years that we've heard about the hardships and the disease associated with the Great Migration and the high rates of infectious diseases amongst these Black immigrants coming from the South. But we never really talk about, well, what happened to them when they died.
Right.
And so I think for me, that's an important narrative. And so I don't take what I do lightly. For me, it's a matter of social justice, and it's a matter of telling these stories that need to be told. And because for years, these folks were essentially neglected, disappeared, forgotten about. I mean, we don't talk about who these people are in these collections. Over the years, they've become body parts. They've become, femora, tibiae, skulls, ribs, tuberculosis. They've become diseases. They've come to embody what disease they held in their life. They've become tuberculosis. They've become, treponemal disease. But we don't really talk about who they were as a whole. And you can't have the biology without the identity. It just doesn't work. So you have to understand who the person was in order to understand what is reflected in their biology.
So I take it back. Earlier I said that the thread connecting all of your research was marginalization and understanding what happened to people that weren't as valuable in the eyes of society. I think what you said just now, that what you really want to do is tell stories that need to be told but haven't. I think that is actually a much better way of putting it.
It is. I mean, I agree, but marginalization is still sort of the thread that ties that all together, because these were all marginalized individuals. So it's sort of like, I guess, the building block, if that makes sense, or the piece of, or the line of sinew that ties it all together, if we want to be, anthropological, because that's essentially what it is. It's and it's some of the things I learn in my research, and I've published on some of the individual narratives. You don't forget some of these folks, and they sort of stick with you, and their stories resonate.
Is there a story in particular that stands out to you that you want to share with the listeners?
Well, there's one that I published on a few years back about a particular male, and I'll just use his first initial, J. Jay had fractures all over his body that were, consistent with someone who engaged in a lot of interpersonal violence. He had a lot of rib fractures. He had a fracture of his fifth finger, and he had other fractures in his fingers. He had fractures in his arms. He had, so just speaking generally. And then he had some toe fractures. and he had some skull fractures as well. And
Wow.
so, huh?
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, Jay was pretty rugged. And so he was one of the few individuals. Luckily, I could sort of trace his history based on what I knew about him and the collection that he was in, because I knew his name. And he was not born in poverty, and he was not born poor. He was born to a family that had property, that was wealthy in property. But his dad passed away, and then his mom went to live with him. And then his brother, who had a problem with alcoholism, his brother actually tried to kill his mother.
Oh,
And
no.
oh yeah, I know, it's just bizarre. His brother tried to kill his mother, and eventually his mother died. I think a year after the incident. I think the brother shot her. I can't remember. And so after that, Jay's history sort of gets a little murky, in the sense that he's still in the rural. So he hasn't moved into the urban landscape of St. Louis yet. He's in St. Louis County still, but you start to see things that he's indebted to the brewery, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's indebted to the local brewery, so you're like, okay. And then you start to see in the newspapers that, okay, he's indebted to the local brewery, and then he was put in the poorhouse for beating his wife.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And this happened twice, actually, that he was put in the poorhouse for beating his wife. And then there was another report of him being abusive towards his wife. And then when he passed away, there was just a line mentioned that he had passed away. But when his son had passed away, the family claimed the remains, and they had a nice little write-up about the son, and they buried the son. And so it turns out that what happened, it looks like that whatever, and interpreting just from those crumbs that you find in newspapers and public reports, it looks like he started out as an upstanding gentleman. He had a problem with alcohol. He developed a problem with alcohol like his brother had, and he just slid downhill from there, in terms of being abusive towards his wife, and in terms of getting involved in a lot of altercations. And so his story was quite fascinating, in the sense that, here's a family that didn't claim him, but they claimed his son, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't look like it was a financial thing. And the other thing, too, is that it's a good reminder that not everyone in these collections were born into poverty, but upon their deaths, they certainly died in poverty. So
Yeah, it's amazing. It's a whole arc of a life based on a couple newspaper articles, and then the physical remains.
right, and it's something, I enjoy doing. My late husband was a historian, and so I was able to learn the craft of the historian from him, as well as the professor that I worked with at Indiana University, Steve Stowe, who was a historian of the South. And so I'm able to sort of take those methods and apply them to my work. And I think it sort of gives a richer sort of detail of not only what's happening in the environments these individuals are in, but for those individuals who I can trace through time, what happened to them. Like, I know that some, for example, I know they got in shootouts, or they were at a store and the store got robbed and they got shot. And then it was said in the newspaper they would make a recovery. Well, he didn't recover. He died the next day.
Oh no.
So yeah. So it's so you get lucky, and the ones that I get lucky with, that I can find more information on, I publish about their stories, because I think as anthropologists, and particularly as biological anthropologists, we should be quite aware of who these individuals are that we've literally based our methods on. And we may need to rethink how accurate our methods are, because if we're basing all of our methods on females who were institutionalized for 10, 15, 20 years and aren't moving around a lot, that's a problem.
Right. It's a very limited sample, right?
Right.
What we're basing our conclusions on isn't a representative sample of the population.
Exactly.
So I want to ask you, you're so interested in these stories and in these individual stories. And then one of the other things I know about you is that you are a deputy coroner for the Richland County Medical Examiner's Office in Columbia, South Carolina. Does this kind of relate to your academic research?
So being a coroner is more of a deputy coroner is more of a, I guess I see it as a service to the community. I work with William Stevens, who's also a deputy coroner and biological anthropologist. He was one of my first graduate students. I co-chaired his committee, and he works on all things. I just work on individuals who are predominantly skeletonized or burned. But the individuals that we end up identifying, and sometimes we do get actually archaeological or historic individuals, but the individuals, most of the individuals we end up identifying are also sort of, it's a similar, I guess, socioeconomic strata compared to what I literally work with in my historic and bioarch research.
I just want to insert something real quick. This is actually something that happens fairly frequently. People will find skeletons and they call the police, and it turns out that that skeleton's been there for like 300 years.
yeah, or it's or as in the case in Indiana and a couple of cases that we had when I was there, they were individuals who were anatomized, and so the doctors who anatomized them kept their remains, and then I guess they forgot about them in the attics of their house, and they were discovered years later. So, because in the old days, you could take home elements of your person, right? There was no sort of regulation over that. Elements of the person that you dissect. I don't like using the term cadaver. Today we use donor or patient. So you could take home elements of your donor and keep them for yourself or for your anatomical cabinet. So doctors and particularly pathologists would collect pathological elements of individuals, and that formed an anatomical cabinet. Or they would collect a whole individual who had, pathologies distributed across their skeleton. I mean, let's be honest. The Hunterian exists. The Hunterian in London exists for a reason. Right. And that's because John Hunter collected every pathological element of a person that he could. Today, we would say it was unethical the way he did it. But in his time period, there were no medical ethics. So,
I mean, I have to admit that my both my grandfather and my grandmother were doctors.
Okay.
And when in South America, and when they got engaged, my grandfather's engagement gift to my grandmother was a human skull.
Oh, wow. Wow. She got hooked with a skull.
And of course, me being a biological anthropologist, I was like, wow, that's so romantic and so unethical. And everyone in my family is like horrified by this story.
But I guess as biological anthropologists, we can sort of step back and look at this. Like, we can sort of contextualize it historically and understand it, right? And understand its significance. So the identification that I do as a deputy coroner isn't always directly related to my research, but there's always that sinewy tie, I guess you could say, of marginalization. Because usually the individuals that we discover that are skeletonized, first, a body has to be missing for a long time for it to be skeletonized, right? And so usually they end up being individuals who were wanderers or who were travelers or who were transient, is the term I'm looking for, transient or homeless, or cases of domestic violence. And those are always the hardest ones, the domestic violence cases, because they escalate in a way that it's just truly horrific.
And you can see that evidence on the body, generally, even the skeleton.
You can see it on the skeleton in the form of healed or unhealed fractures or gunshot wounds. One case, and I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about my cases, but there was one case that was particularly not pleasant, and to put it politely, and a gunshot wound was involved, and then they set the body on fire. And had they not done that, had they not set the body on fire, it probably would not have been identified. But they ended up burning 3 or 4 acres of the woods as well. So they had to call the fire department. When you call the fire department, they have researchers that try and find the source of the fire. And in this case, the individual was the source of the fire. And so that was a particularly rough case.
I bet. Do you think
Yeah.
do you think you could take me through either a real case or a hypothetical case, kind of like how it starts, when do you get called in, what kind of work do you do once you receive the remains, and then kind of what your involvement is post identification if possible?
Sure, sure. I think maybe I can talk about one case that I worked on in Greensboro in Guilford County. So what happens is that usually you get a call from a detective, or here I get the call from the coroner's office. But in Greensboro, I would get the call from the detective directly. And he would say, "Hey, Doc, we found these bones. Can we bring them to you to ascertain whether or not they're human or animal?" And we know what we need to do if they're human. If they're human, we know we all need to go to the crime scene and strike a crime scene zone and that sort of thing, and quarantine off the area, mark off the area, and then start having the rookies go out and survey to see if they find more human remains. Now, usually though, if it's a complete body, they know and they call and they say, "Hey, Doc, we're sure it's human. We need you to come out and excavate the person and identify the person." And so the case that I had in Greensboro, I got a call, and I remember it was right before I was going in to teach my medicine, disease, and slavery class. And he just said, "We know it's human, Doc. We need you to come out and remove it." So I had to assemble a team. So I had an archaeologist. I always like to have an archaeologist with me. And we went out. I spoke with the detectives. They had already had their rookies go shoulder to shoulder throughout the property to see if they found any other remains, any other bones, essentially. And they flagged every area where they found bones. And then they gave me the bones after they had flagged the areas. In this particular case, all the other bones were not human. We had a concentrated area, so then we demarcated our crime scene within that area. And this individual was completely skeletonized. And so then we started excavating him. He still had his clothes on. Actually, I can say that down coats do last a very long time, as do polyester pants.
Mm-hmm.
And
And actually, I just want to say something real quick. Having an archaeologist on the scene with you is clutch because they are so detail oriented and they're so patient. One of the things that I loved when I was still doing biological anthropology was they only ever called me in when they knew that they found something. Archaeologists have the patience to sit there and dig and brush slowly until they find something for like weeks and months at a time. So having one on scene with you, amazing.
Right. So this was when I was at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I mean, Dr. Linda Stein with me, who was an archaeologist, and then we had one of our leading top undergrads, because we didn't have a graduate program, and she was a brilliant mapper, and so she actually mapped the scene while we were going through and excavating and screening. And so I think I finished up everything at about 12 a.m., 1 a.m. So in that particular case, now it depends on how jurisdiction works. In this particular case in Greensboro, I did not have jurisdiction over the remains. Another medical examiner had jurisdiction over the remains. So the remains they went with that medical examiner to be identified. But I told the detectives what I could observe in the field based on what I saw. And this rarely happens on one's first or second case, that you actually get an identification right away. But for us, we were just very lucky based on what we saw. It was a clear cut in terms of identification, one of the more easier individuals to identify. And we had, they ran it through missing persons, the quick biological profile I gave them. And they had two people match. One was Euro-American, the other one was African-American. We knew this was an older African-American gentleman. So we were able to identify him, and he had been missing for 5 years. So
wow.
He was an older gentleman. I think he was in his 80s, and he had Alzheimer's. And so he had been missing for 5 years. So it was just nice to be able to give that family peace and closure.
I was going to say, if he's in the missing persons database, then someone must have been looking for him.
Exactly. So, and the clothing that we had matched the clothing that he was last seen in. It was a relief. It felt nice to do that. Here, because it's a larger coroner's office, they will send out other deputy coroners, or the coroner himself will go out to the scene, and then they will ascertain if they need us, and then they'll call me, Or I'll get a text of bones. Is it human? Is it not human? The weirdest text I ever got looked like a dog skeleton, and there was lingerie around it. I don't ask questions. But here it's the deputy coroner's office that calls and says, okay, we need you on site for this, or we need you to identify this. And then if I have to go out, I'll go out. Some of the weirder ones have been someone put 2 deer legs in one of those little igloo cooler things. And so we got a call at like 10 o'clock at night. One of the deputy coroners called me and said, "Oh, you need to go out to the site. It's near the base out there in the sticks, and to see if it's human or not." So I said, "Sure." So I went out, and I just came from work, so I still had on my suit. Anyone who knows me knows I wear suits to work. And I had on my suit, I had on my dress shoes, but I went out. We opened it, and then we looked at it. I said, that doesn't look right. It had already started to decompose. There was I won't go into the graphic detail about the things and the separation during decomposition. But so we tipped it a bit. It was a deer. It wasn't human.
I think this is worth saying. I think when people call on forensic anthropologists, the first question is always, is it human? And a shocking amount of the time, the answer is no.
You have the case of a tragically murdered deer, my friend, or a tragically murdered cow. But there are cases you get where it's clearly a human individual.
Yeah, but I think it's worth noting that always should be the first question. Is it even human?
Is it human? How many people are there?
And then the second question is it of forensic interest, or is this historic?
Right. And that's a very good point. Is it historic? Is it archaeological, or is it forensic? And because if it's archaeological versus historic, there are, depending upon where you are in the U.S., there are certain, I guess, procedures that have to be followed in regard to NAGPRA and ethical engagement with human remains.
And NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which governs how Native American remains are handled by institutions. Right.
And so there are some differences state by state in terms of that. In other instances, I've been called. Bill has already recovered the remains, so William Stevens, the other deputy coroner, and so I'm called in to assist in identifying and ascertaining, creating the biological profile or ascertaining pathology. What sort of disease is this? There's some interesting skeletal changes on these bones. Is it tuberculosis? Is it what's going on?
And what kind of things can you determine from the bones? Like what goes into your biological profiles that you provide investigators?
So the things, there's always we always call it the basic list, right? But then there are things beyond that. So the identifying factors we try to ascertain that assist in law enforcement: age, stature, so height, ancestry. Although we know biologically that race doesn't exist, it's hard to get law enforcement out of that mindset. And even in forensic anthropology in the journals, there's been a lot of work related to race, and race I put in quotes, and ascertaining ancestry from the skeleton. But we have methods that we use to ascertain ancestry, but it's not cut and go. And as time goes on, especially in today's era, it's more and more difficult to say securely that someone is this versus that because of gene flow.
Mm-hmm. People are having beautiful multiracial babies.
Well, I was going to say Tinder exists, but that would be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to understand too is that you don't ever look at a skeleton and you're like, yep, 100%. Well, maybe if it's like historic or archaeological, maybe you can say 100%, but generally it's like a statistical probability. You look at something and you're like, nah, I'm for like 70% sure that this is A or B.
Right. I wish I was 70% sure majority of the times, but and there are programs such as FORDIS. So basically, forensic anthropologists will measure skulls, and there are no sort of points on a skull that we can measure to give us an idea of the size and shape of a person's skull. And if they're sure about the ancestry, they can upload that data into the FORDIS database. And so forensic anthropologists use that as well. My experiences with FORDIS have not always been 100%. But so we try and do the best we can with ancestry because that's what law enforcement sort of need. It's like they have this need to know that. So any sort of identifying characteristics, so any unique things that we may see in the skeleton. So if they have a joint replacement, for example, right, those bits have numbers on them. If they have unique pathology, if they have fractures that didn't heal right, if there's well, we can't see their sinuses, but if you take an X-ray of the skull and you see that their sinuses are very, very unique. And we know about Doug Owsley's case, right, about how he identified the missing journalist. I think it was in El Salvador. He had just had a few fragments of his skull, and his sinuses were actually so unique they were able to match that patterning with previous X-rays that the doctor had in this individual's record to make a match. And all he had of this journalist, he could fit in his hand. Literally, there was their bone fragments. And so he just luckily, by a stroke of luck, and I always say, and I guess this may boil down to my own personal faith, but I always say when a person wants to be identified and found, they will be, come heck or high water. And in this case, just by luck, they had that frontal sinus fragment of the skull, and that's what led to the identification. So any unique sort of anatomical features or pathologies that will help us identify the individual. Biological sex, which we can determine from looking at the pelvis and the skull. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not always cut and dry either.
Yeah.
Sometimes folks are not definitely male, and they're not definitely female in terms of how we identify them. Sometimes they have mixed characteristics, and especially as individuals get older and their skeleton changes, it gets a little harder.
Yeah, especially when you only have like parts of a skeleton, it can be very difficult to identify sex. But even sometimes different populations, like archaeological populations, I remember one time with Doug Owsley, we had a skeleton and he pulled out that skeleton. It had to be like 10, 15 times over the course of the week. He'd look at it, get grumpy, put it away, and then he'd pull it back out again a couple hours later. And he was just trying to determine the sex, and he couldn't figure it out.
Doug was and remains one of my mentors, and he's a great anthropologist. And as a person, he's really a genuine person.
He is probably one of the kindest people I've ever met in my entire life.
Definitely. And I worked with him and David Hunt I did a predoctoral fellowship at the Smithsonian, and I enjoyed my time there and what I learned from both of them. But Doug and I would burn that midnight oil. We would be there late. And so I learned so much from him. And some of those late nights spent, when Kari would lay out like skeletons for him for the come and film whatever documentary show or whatever, or whoever.
Yeah.
And
that's Kari Burlhide for listeners, just in case you want to look her up. She's fascinating in her own right.
And she's awesome too.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's true that biological sex isn't always guaranteed from our identification, and we do the best we can with the methods and the tools that we have. Today, DNA has become so cheap, though. I shouldn't say so cheap, but it's cheaper than what it was.
Mm-hmm. And faster.
And faster, definitely faster. And so sometimes it just depends on the organization you're working with, though. They may want to call in the forensic anthropologist first before spending money on DNA. It just depends on what works out for them financially in terms of, logistics, as well as how long it would take a lab to bring something back to them, whether or not it's going to the state lab or whether or not it has to go. Sometimes things have to go to the federal lab because the state lab doesn't have those resources. And the federal labs, we now have a backlog of things.
Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite things with like forensic anything on TV shows like Law and Order or NCIS or Bones, where they just they're like, I need the DNA. And like 10 minutes later, they have DNA. I'm like, oh, right. So you have unlimited money and technology that doesn't exist.
But wait, can we please talk about the Angelotron?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Bones. I've talked about this with other anthropologists. There's so much with that show, and I still watch it even though I know I look at it and I'm like, what is even happening?
I can't. Sometimes I can't. I can tell by his third molar. He's 32 years old. I'm like, girl, if you can tell that, I don't know who you studied under, but.
My favorite is that every time Angela made a representation of the person based on the skeleton, she always got the hair color right. I'm like, how?
Oh gosh, and Christina Kilgrove has done a lot of. She used to blog on Bones on the shows themselves, and they're great blogs to read. So those are some of the key things we look for. There are a number of other issues, but I think for the general public, those are the main ones that we sort of hone in on and focus in on. As forensic anthropologists, doing the forensic. I always say doing the forensic work because I just see myself trained more broadly as a bioarchaeologist, biological anthropologist. But you could take me and pull me out of the Smithsonian and drop me in the middle of an excavation of drug dealers have stored bodies somewhere, hid bodies. I'm from Florida, can you tell? I could easily use the same methods that I use on the individuals that I study and anatomically collection.
Wow. Okay. This interview has gone on for a long time, and so I want to thank you for your time. No. I thank you so much for your time because I know just talking to you, you are clearly a very busy and interesting woman. So thank you for spending so much time with us.
No, I'm happy to do so. I'm really happy to do so. I love engaging with the public about what I do and sort of improving, I guess, the reputation of the discipline with the public because I know that our discipline, its history is not pretty. And I want the public to know that we are changed as a discipline and we're moving forward as a discipline and acknowledging the past. I don't want to use the term horrors, but they really are horrors. And the scientific racism in which the discipline was born in, we're moving past that and we're looking at that now more critically in terms of how we can move forward and make this discipline more public and more accessible.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. We're trying really hard. People are at least becoming more reflexive and trying to think more about the impact of what has come before and what could come in the future. It's time for my final 3 questions. So my first question is, if people want to learn more about your discipline, what is a good place for them to start in terms of reading? Like what's a good book or a good article or a good journal for them to look at?
So in terms of our discipline in general?
Sure.
Or there have been a lot of good. I always tell my students if they're interested in forensic anthropology to start with Bill Maples' Dead Men Do Tell Tales.
Oh, right? That's a great book. I actually just finished it.
Yeah, isn't it good? And it's I love his story about finding all the different body parts from the one guy all across points of Florida. But, I'm sorry, spoilers.
Sorry. No, but I think the writing is actually really the writing is really compelling, which sometimes with science books not so much, but with that one it certainly is.
Right, and it's a great book. And then for bioarchaeology, it sort of gets. I know in the past our discipline's sort of been honed in on sort of very specialized and specific language, but I find a lot of work by George Armelagos and Deb Martin very easy to read and accessible to the public in terms of understanding what we do and how we do it. So that would be Deborah L. Martin and George Armelagos.
I will put up some samples of their work on the website. Okay, so second question, what are you reading for work right now?
So what I'm reading for work right now, my students, 2 of my grad students are in the process of writing their dissertation, so I've been reading that. And actually reading the Anatomy, I think it's called The Anatomy Museum by Hallam. And then, a number of publications that are coming out now incorporating theory and thinking about structural violence and applying it to both the past and historic skeletal populations, so literature in that as well. And a lot of literature on dissection and history, because that's one of my sort of sub-interests. And some things on Civil War medicine, because I have an article that I'm finishing up that deals with amputation in the Civil War.
I've got to say, one of the things I love about anthropologists, like regardless of subdiscipline, is that we're all like intellectual magpies.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So last question, final question of the interview. What are you reading for fun right now, or consuming for fun if you're not reading for fun?
So everyone that knows me knows that I'm a Sherlockian. So I always consume the Sherlock Holmes stories for fun because I write about them. And I actually have two book chapters that I have to write that deal with different aspects of Sherlock Holmes, both race and scientific racism, as well as identifying bones in a particular study or story and how we know they were not human versus that. But also Blaylock. I've been reading James Blaylock, homunculus science fiction. He was a science fiction author, or he is a science fiction author. And I guess some consider him the father of steampunk. So that's been fun consuming. And what else am I consuming for fun? Doctor Who.
I love this. I don't even know, how do you have time to talk to me? You're reading so much. You're watching TV. It's amazing.
I don't watch a lot of TV, but when I do.
Wow. I feel like you're so interesting, and I feel like I could definitely just keep on talking to you. But I have to go take my little dog for a walk. She's staring at me angrily from an armchair right now.
Poor thing.
No, she's just kind of an angry dog. She's a Chihuahua, so it is what it is.
Oh, those are feisty.
She's a Chihuahua Dachshund mix. Her personality is much bigger than her body. We'll just put it that way. Anyway, I want to thank you so much for joining me. I would love to have you on the show in the future.
I would be more than happy to come on the show in the future. I could even give you a whole show on the anthropology of Sherlock Holmes if you wanted it. So
that would be fantastic. And
happy to do it.
Well, for now, I'm just going to say thank you very much, and I'll talk to you soon.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to those of you that have listened. And I hope everyone has a good day, evening, morning, whatever time it may be, in whatever zone you're in.
All right. Bye, listeners.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthropology podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.